So to start with the historical context, so when Japan left, their actual, like when they actually left, it was like quite surprising to a lot of Koreans. There was really like not enough anticipation leading up to the event, and so what had happened was that a lot of Koreans basically set up a bunch of scattered committees throughout the peninsula, trying to figure out, okay, like what does self-determination look for us? Like what do we want to do now? And so what was established eventually was the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence in 1945. And so this was a coalition of a smattering of committees throughout the entire peninsula. And while there was like a broad range of different political opinion, a lot of them focused on decolonization as the #1 priority. However, so the committee was established in 1945, but only 20 days later, the U.S. Army arrived into the Korean Peninsula on September 7th, 1945, and declared itself as the only legitimate power. So what happened because of this was basically they outlawed any political distance, as well as started to crack down on a lot of the leftist politics that were happening within Korea. And so a lot of this is due to the Moscow Agreement. So actually, originally with post-World War II, Russia was US, or at the time USSR, was initially charged of Northeast Asia, like post the conflict. But ultimately, the United States realized, oh no, this has a lot of great geopolitical significance. We actually want some of that. And so eventually with the Moscow Agreement, they came to the decision to host a sort of trusteeship over the peninsula, and then in turn created the separation of the two governments, North Korea and South Korea, with USSR residing in the north and the US residing in the south. And also an important thing to note throughout these negotiations was that Syngman Rhee, who happens to be the first military dictator that takes over, was actually one of the first people to initiate conversation around two separate governments. And so eventually in 1946, there was a huge anti-communist policy that was adopted. And quickly soon after, leftist newspapers were suspended, arrest warrants were out for anyone suspected of being communist or part of the Communist Party. But while this was specifically an anti-communist policy, this really extended to anyone that was a dissident of that current government. And so to move on, let's talk about Jeju, where my family's from. So Jeju has a lot, the specific instance has a lot of different names, and that's a common theme throughout both Jeju and Gwangju, because communism was so stigmatized. There was just like, and also a lot of overt government attempts to suppress a lot of information going out. There was just a lot of different names tied to these events because of ongoing understandings and evolving political understandings and memories of these events. But for the purposes of the presentation, I'm just going to call it Jeju 4-3. So during this time, mass arrests, detentions, forced relocations, torture, indiscriminate killings, and large-scale massacres were rampant during this time. So what had happened was initially, so basically, Park Chung-hee was another military dictator that came after Syngman Rhee, and he was actually assassinated by the Korean CIA. And people being so frustrated with his military dictatorship assumed that, you know, maybe this could be the chance for our own self-governance, like we could actually have our own self-governing democracy. However, at this time, it was just another, you know, military dictator took over. And so what happened was that approximately 10% of the total population of Jeju were killed as a result. And also, going back, I just realized I accepted events in Gwangju and Jeju. Actually, the reason why there was so much insurrection within Jeju was a result of, so the result was because with the Syngman Rhee elections, they're trying to do these elections that were actually sponsored by the UN. A lot of the Korean people were really frustrated and saw them as like faulty elections or didn't actually represent their own political beliefs. So with this period between 1947 to 1958, most victims were teens or in their 20s, but 12% were under 10 years old or more than 16 years old. So there was a lot of indiscriminate killings going on where soldiers would just raid different villages or excavate people. There are also reports of military personnel presenting themselves as insurgents to lure people out and execute them on the spot. So while most of the killings happened toward the beginning of the period, around from like 1947 to 1949, they declined for a bit, but then surged with the Korean War as communism again became a question of like huge stigmatization and brutality. And so more than 1,100 people were detained in connection with suspected communists. So even if they were communists themselves, this included like school teachers, relatives, partners, children, that kind of thing. So even though technically a lot of these people were relocated, most of them were just never seen again. So there are thousands of Jeju Islanders who have just essentially disappeared as a result. And so shockingly, there actually was a Jeju Truth Commission that came out in 2000, but this came out over 50 years later after the events of all these things and killings that happened. And so while there had been some gains made through that Truth Commission, there's been a lot of criticism, like why did it take so long for our truths to be revealed? And actually connected to Gwangju, as I'm going to get into later, it was only until after the Gwangju uprising where people started to actually support these people that were rising up against the government. And so to move on to Gwangju, this started in 1980. So this was only, as compared to Jeju massacre, which happened like with the course of a number of years, the Gwangju uprising was only a 10-day event. So basically it started, as I was saying earlier, the assassination of President Park Chung-hee by the Korean CIA chief. And so what had happened was that because of that, they had instituted martial law essentially. And because of that, schools were shut down, but like people hadn't realized at that point. And also additionally, because military dictatorship was so normalized and student protests were so normalized that most people didn't see these demonstrations as like anything new. Like most people were sort of like, oh, just like another protest. But what had differentiated the Gwangju uprising from other student demonstrations in the past is that actually Black Berets, which were army paratroopers that were specialized to essentially eliminate any like North Korean spies, cracked down brutally on these students. So they're beaten, clubbed, knifed, bayoneted. And so best estimates available today suggest that about 500 civilians were killed and over 3,000 were injured. But throughout the research that I was doing, I had found that even though these numbers are out there, they're still not a really like unitarily agreed upon like number to these deaths and arrests. And additionally, a lot of people, like even if they weren't necessarily killed, there are a lot of survivors of Gwangju who are living today with the consequences of that trauma. So they were left with physical, psychological, and sociocultural problems. And in one of the studies I was reading, in one report, 91.7% experienced signs of post-traumatic stress disorders, and 97% of interviewees report not being satisfied with their quality of life, with 0% of them saying they were. So it's just really telling of the conditions that these Gwangju survivors are living with, especially because, again, there was a lot of stigma associated with uprising against the government. It was just usually written off as just like, being communist, as well as the fact that so much of information was being controlled by the government that even at one point during the uprising, people were setting fire to the public broadcasting stations because they were releasing false information. Ultimately, it took a while for people to like build up political power again to take back their self-governance and democracy. And so, so this led to democratization because in 1987, eventually through the internal building with students and workers and laborers, they eventually were able to amass a movement in 1987 that, while this was not the only one of its kind, it was really the climax of a lot of the buildup to this moment that eventually pressured the Chung-Kwan military dictatorship to eventually accede, okay, we'll be a transitory regime and move towards democracy. And so when thinking about the conversation about democracy, one of the things that I found really notable is that even, despite the U.S. military government literally being instituted in Korea during like the 1945 to 1948 period, Korean people still have the U.S. as in high regard as, democracy, as, protecting like human rights. But however, this was all shattered essentially with the Gwangju uprising because the Carter administration actually, released a statement that said they had decided to support the restoration of security and order in South Korea while deferring pressure for political liberalization, which in a lot of fancy words basically means we are supporting the military dictatorship, or we basically approve that we're not going to intervene. And so this is particularly chilling because the president, so while Chung Kwan wasn't necessarily the president, he was basically acting president as he was in control of the entire Korean military. But the basically like puppet president that was sitting there, he released a statement saying that North Korean communist espionage against our nation is causing social chaos. These spies have deeply infiltrated our society and are encouraging and praising the recent campus disturbances. In this very volatile and critical time, some irresponsible and unpatriotic politicians, students, and workers are threatening national security. And so, in contrast to the actual accounts of students and protesters on the ground, this is a clear example of the ways that of how the government basically weaponized any association with North Korea, with the communism, to basically justify any kind of brutal suppression of people's protests. And that just became a common theme throughout all of these things. And again, I think that the last line I just want to highlight threatening national security. So much of the military dictatorships were able to justify themselves as being able to protect the people from this communist threat. And so when people were seeing that, these forces that were meant for supposedly North Korean communists were actually being turned against their own citizens, people were starting to question, okay, what is this actually doing? And the legitimacy of these military dictatorships essentially crumbled as a result of that. And so this is another account from a third-year theology student during this time. And so something that I want to highlight is that, I can just read the quote, but the reason why we chose this extreme method of setting fire to yet another American cultural center in Korea was to chastise the U.S. for the historical crime that is committed on Korean soil. Even a 3-year-old child knows that, based on the Korean-American Defense Pact, all mobilization rights for our army are under the jurisdiction of the commander of U.S. forces in South Korea. And so this just goes back to, again, the U.S.'s heavy involvement with Korea. And ultimate, so it actually came out after the Jogye Massacre that the government, the U.S. government actually approved of the troops. And so because under this Korean-American Defense Pact, the U.S. was essentially in control of the Korean military. And so they were the ones that actually gave the approval for these troops to be sent out against these protesters. And so, before I end, eventually, I didn't have enough time to finish this slide, but essentially, with my research, I really sought out to just better understand what Korean history looked like, what did political protests look like, and I think I really came out of it with the really chilling understanding that, while I had my doubts or qualms with the U.S. military or U.S. involvement in Korea, it actually ran a lot deeper than I had expected. Nothing could have prepared me for the brutal, gruesome accounts of people, being killed, of mass graves being happening. It was just absolutely horrid. And so, interestingly enough, as a political science major, throughout my own educational training at Penn, I had been taught so much about democratization theory and this idea that, while I also was a critique of it, but I was critical of this perspective that the U.S. was a beacon of democracy throughout the 80s and helped, bring democracy to the global South. And I think, through my research, while this is a very specific case study on Korea and their Korean political history toward self-determination and independence, I think it really speaks to the fact that there are so many other countries within the global South have been similarly impacted, most notably Vietnam, as well as so many other countries. And essentially thinking about Korea in the context of this larger history, the Korean War happened within the 1950s and essentially acted as the test subject for the United States' containment policy to really repress any political dissent and really essentially control the trajectory of newly independent nations that were newly independent under these restrictions of U.S. government and U.S. military involvement. And so I think ultimately when thinking about human rights abuses, while Gwangju, this specific uprising did bring about a lot of change, surprisingly or unfortunately. So for context, within this Gwangju uprising, a lot of the outrage was also stemmed from one of the primary opposition leaders being arrested, named Kim Dae-jung. But eventually, after these dictatorships, Kim Dae-jung did eventually get political power, which is why a lot of Korean literature or Korean political history literature ends up around 1990. But when Kim Dae-jung ascended into his presidency, he made a lot of concessions, most notably hugging Chun Dae-hwan as a symbol of oh, we're moving on, even though clearly a lot of Gwangju survivors don't feel the same way, as well as with the Jeju massacre that I mentioned earlier. There are news articles as late as or as recently as 2019, where only recently a lot of Jeju Islanders have recently had their criminal records wiped from their charges of being communists. And so these things are ongoing. I really want to stress that, the Korean War has not officially ended. These things are things that we really need to consider when thinking about the future of, these newly independent nations, and really understanding that democracy is not always what it seems, and really considering political democracy is not just an individual choice about civil rights, but rather ones that can be really rooted in broader mass populist people power, as well as this search for self-determination, especially post-colonialism. So thank you so much for our presentation.
Thank you, Kingsley. Let's open up for some questions based on what you've shared. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting, and I think even in Vietnamese, I see a lot of parallels of what you were talking about in Vietnam and Southeast Asia broadly. I'm wondering if you've thought about, I think you talked a lot about the framework of democracy and democratization, having a more insidious sort of dimension that people do not discuss as much when they think about democracy. I wonder if you have thought similarly about a human rights approach or a human rights framework in the context of the framework of human rights being from the UN, which is still a very Western institution.
Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I think that's definitely something that I've been really grappling with. It's definitely something I need to do more research in. But however, in the international human rights courts that I take it, while there was a lot of input from actors in the global South into the actual implementation of international human rights law, ultimately, as we see, if they're only upheld some of the time and only in some parts of the world, whose human rights are we actually protecting? And ultimately, again, there's a lot of critiques and issues with international human rights law as well, as you've already pointed out. But especially having been created within the UN, while that's not anything bad, so much of it was so heavily inputted by the United States. And as a result of that, so much does have an emphasis on individual rights rather than thinking about collective, restorative rights, especially after having dealt with such traumatic occupation from colonial powers. So I think that's really through my research, since it's a midpoint presentation. I think throughout, I really want to flesh out this project to really consider what are ways that we can actually consider human rights from a more decolonial perspective, and really understanding them as not just, again, just individual rights of what I can or cannot do, but more so about actually really respecting the dignity of human life, and really considering what does healing and actual self-determination look like in practice. Thanks for the question. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing. I have a question. There's a lot of parallels too in where I'm from, and right now we can also see it for example, U.S. military involvement in the Middle East and everything when it comes to restore peace, or at least to more conflict, and they've been pulling out in Afghanistan, for example. And what kind of strategy can you guys put to trying to help those countries without actually, using military power? Do you have any other is there any other kind of study case where U.S. actually use SelfDiplomacy, for example, and actually resolve problems in conflicted countries?
That's a really good question. And I think it's a particularly relevant one, especially as you pointed out, this is nothing new, this is ongoing, whether it be in Korea, whether it be throughout the global South, this is a continuing issue. While I can't speak directly to a specific case study where this has worked, I genuinely can't think of any, because the only other ways of influencing that the United States has tried to enact or through sanctions, but as we know, sanctions can also, disproportionately affect people that are being sanctioned against, particularly the more marginalized or lower income, the more vulnerable communities, as opposed to actually people who are in power and benefiting from, their unnecessary rule. And so I think, ultimately, I don't think there really is a good answer, which is probably pretty dissatisfying to hear. But I think ultimately, when we think about, especially these more newly independent nations, I think we really need to consider their own self-determination, because, within international law, international law, right? I think one of the major sticking points of the international law is this idea of self-determination and protecting your nation state. And so I think because this hasn't really necessarily been held up for post-colonial nations, I think there's a lot to consider there in terms of actually reframing the conversation to be like, okay, but what do these people need? What are the demands being made by it on the ground? And so, yeah, I can't speak to specific case studies, for example, but I think, like, for example, specifically within Korea, like, you know, these communities that were rising up throughout the entire peninsula, they clearly had a vision for what their own self-determining government could look like. It was only until the U.S. intervened that that vision was essentially like, destroyed until like, decades later. So I think ultimately, I would argue, I personally am of the opinion that we should really just think about the self-determination of those people at the forefront.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My question is actually more focused on like your research, but I was wondering for the books that you've been reading, have most of them been like in English, and have you tried to read those that are written in Korean? Like, how big of a difference do you think like language and where like that source is coming from would change like your research and what you've been finding so far?
It's a really good question. Thank you, Sabrina. I think, yeah, so for full transparency, my Korean, like, even though I am in an advanced Korean class right now, that is quite misleading. So I will not be able to read governmental documents in Korean. So all the sources that I have been reading have been in English, but I think the main way that I have been trying to counteract with that is by, reading as many Korean and Korean American scholars that I can. But I think that's something that I do want to explore more, especially with some of the grant money that I have been able to raise for my research, and potentially considering getting a translator to look at especially more important documents, specifically martial law documents, or perhaps looking at, particularly with the Gwangju uprising, there was like a mass popular effort to like document all these testimonies and like interviews and all these, and even like leaflets that people were like handing out. And so that's another document I'm considering getting external translation for. But I think even with the conversation translation, that's so like, I feel like there's a lot of political weight to that as well. Just because I think like there are different ways that you can interpret or like translate that into English, and I definitely think that there are definitely limitations to my research as a result of only being able to really look at English documents.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to learn more about your research. I would love to hear if you have plans to continue this work after Penn, as grad school in your future. I also, not so much fully formed question, but I find it impossible to remove, like separate out your positionality coming from the Bay Area and thinking about like student movements. And have you thought about like what growing up in the Bay Area, how that's impacted your lens on like student protests and student movement?
I would say definitely grad school is potentially in my future. She's working there in the background. We'll see what happens. But it's definitely like research that I would love to continue, particularly because I think it still feels like really relevant. And so I think some areas of future research would be really interesting to explore, just with the livelihood of survivors after these incidents. Because what was really interesting in the report about Gwangju survivors is that this occurred in the 1980s, but by the 1990s, when people were still like, hey, like I still have shattered like bullets like in my body and I'm getting lead poisoning, like people were still like, oh, but that's over now. Like we're done. You're like we heralded you as the heroes, and like that's it. Like why are you asking for more? And so interestingly enough, currently, I think I would really be interested in the current shift when it comes to like Korean organizing within Korea, because it's moved away almost from this idea of like fighting against like political suppression to more almost like a pacification of like, oh, we need to work with the government and we need like do this in a more diplomatic way. And so when, for example, with the Gwangju, I know I'm pulling from this example a lot, but with the Gwangju survivors, a lot of what their current demands or like more recent demands have framed their argument as more of a human rights issue, like, oh, but according to the Constitution, like Koreans have the human right to like be happy and like have healthy rather than being like, this government has wronged us, you know? And so that's a really interesting development that I would love to explore more in future research. But when it comes to the Bay Area, I think that's definitely colored my own lens on the world. I think, you know, I'm incredibly grateful and fortunate and lucky to have grown up in the Bay Area where, you know, critical studies has been like really present, as well as being, you know, in close contact with a bunch of different grassroots organizers in the area doing the work. And so I think, yeah, I think I'm definitely of the bias of like wanting to lead more supportively with these students. But also even right now, self-reflectively being very aware that like I am, you know, like a Korean physician in the United States and like this really privileged academic institution. What does that mean in terms of my own lens and looking at these events? And that's actually something similar that happened within Jeju when they realized that I think almost over 2/3 of the people who are actually killed were like the workers rather than the students who were like leading the ideological charge of this movement. There's a lot of effort to actually like really recruit workers and laborers into their actual like trade union thinking and building that solidarity. And I think those are really poignant themes that I think are still like really important today and something that I'm constantly thinking about. I think particularly because of having grown up with that.
Thank you for that. And your presentation. I've learned so much about Korean history from you, so thank you. I was curious about Jeju and if you happen to know what it is about like the 2000 time period that resulted in the truth commissioning happening at that point, or were there movements prior to that for the survivors to hold the state accountable for what happened?
That's a really good question. Because so I guess from like a little bit of research I got some more like the what had been learned was essentially, you know, the Jogye Massacre. Again, it's an island off of the mainland. So most people like had no idea this was happening. And so it was only like 50 years, 40 to like, so post-Jogye Massacre, when people were starting to see these protesters in a different light as their own heroes of this, like their own like self-determination, they've come to made this whole like popular effort to try to, you know, uncover like all these injustices that people were experiencing. And Jeju was one of the things that like people started to like look more into. And I think it was as a result of, you know, these efforts to like actually get the 2000 commission didn't come out of nowhere. These were efforts that were, you know, very much advocated for by the local like students, by local journalists, you know, by local residents of people who like literally just lived with the trauma. But it was only like through the Guangzhou uprising, unfortunately, that people started to like see things in a different light and started to think about, oh, we should actually like investigate this more. And actually in the 1990s, there was a cave in Jeju that was actually excavated under a bunch of local pressure and found actual remains of like women and children and other people that had been murdered as a result. And basically the Korean government couldn't deny that this had happened anymore. And so because of that immense political pressure, this sort of momentum toward like, you know, people's movements and people's protests and supporting those people, it really only came as a result of that. So those movements existed forever, but you know, just the general public persuaded their own. Thank you. Questions? I know it's a heavy subject, so thank you for sitting with me.
Are there any questions from people in Zoom?
No worries. You can also approach me individually.
Thank you so much, Kingsley, for your presentation. We learned so much today, and best of luck as you continue to grow it and definitely get a grad school. Learn more. We need you. Thank you. Just to alert y'all, we have a couple more events happening in ASAM in the coming weeks. So next week, our UAB is collaborating with the UAB of class to be hosting Evelyn Hu DeHart, who is a professor of history and American Studies at Brown, next Thursday at 6 p.m. She'll be talking about her work on the Asian diaspora and Latin America. And then on Friday, same place, same time, you can come and hear Lily presenting on her ASAM Fellowship program. So I hope to see you all again next Friday.
Friday and maybe even Thursday afternoon. And Zion will be presenting her research in a few weeks. So I'll leave the flyers on the table. Please be sure to grab some lunch before you head out, and thank you for coming.